Questions nobody asks. With a John Michael Swifter. What, was that bad?
So here's a continuation of my rant on how underrated altered bass chords are. So in my last Q&A, I talked about this particular chord, and really got to kind of hear it in the key. It's a bit like this. Here in C, it's this sucker. Something just incredibly, stunningly beautiful about this chord. Now, the essence, I call it the hybrid dominant, and the essence of it is that you have the 4 chord of whatever key you're in with the 5 bass, and it goes to 1. And that's the essence of the hybrid dominant. However, the hybrid dominant is one of an entire class of chords I call altered bass chords, and they're chords that essentially arrive from what are probably like different voices, different instruments moving in different directions, and they just kind of cross each other and something really cool happens. People are like, wow, it's a pretty cool chord. Let's kind of pluck that out of its context and use it other places. But there's really specific characteristics of them. They're usually triads, primarily. You get a triad in the treble, and then a bass note that is either a second, a fourth, or a seventh of that initial triad. And these occur in different places and can be used different ways. So in this video, I'm going to talk about as many examples of these as I've found, and explain how they come about, so maybe you can try to figure out how they would work for you or other songs that you've found them in. Like I said, comment with other songs you think of that use these chords. And we're just going to try to build the biggest library of examples possible, because these are just so great and fun. So in the last video, I talked about Isn't She Lovely as a really famous example of that chord, Barry White song called Can't Get Enough of Your Love. There's 2 examples off the top of my head, but the story does not stop there. There's a couple of really common contrapuntal things that happen that create slash chords in general. One of them is you have like a walking bass line. If you're like on some chord, like I'm on a G here, and the bass line starts walking down, you know, you can think of like Something by the Beatles, that shows up. But the funny thing about that is that, you know, like this chord by itself, it's kind of weird. It's more of like a passing harmony. You don't really stick on it. But usually once you get to a chord like this in the same key, going back to here, is much, much nicer. And I mean, how it shows up is anybody's guess, but they definitely cross in that sense. And so really any chord that has this particular quality of, you know, like a kind of a funny bass note that complements the primary triad nicely is going to have these characteristics. A really famous example of how this kind of crossed over from pop into more classically stuff is All I Ask of You. So say you'll share with me one love, one lifetime. Say the word and I will follow you. That's all I ask of you. So Andrew Lloyd Webber is using a very similar chord, but it's not exactly the 4 and the 5. It's actually the 2 triad instead. So he's got like a D minor with a G in the bass. But you'll find the 2 triad and the 4 triad are often substitutable. The 2 essential notes are the F and the A, which are the 4th and the 6th degree of the original key, and then G is the 5 in the bass. So if you have that 4, the 6, and then the 5 in the bass, you have the makings of this chord. You can add the C or the D to it. You can add like the root, which is a little more stable, or the second, which is a little more sad. But they essentially give you the same idea. It's just a slightly different coloration of the same skeleton. I mean, if you really want to be corny, you can kind of blend the 2. I can kind of do like a D minor 7. It's essentially the same effect too. It's just a very slightly different colorations of the same thing. Another really interesting example is in the Earth, Wind & Fire song September. Do you remember 21st night of September? Never was a cloudy day. Now this, you'll see, he's got one of the same voicings I've been using the whole time. It's an A chord with the 9th and the bass, the B. But if you look at like the song and the progression, the song is actually kind of in the key of A. It's sort of a little bit. It's like the main progression is like a D major 7, C sharp minor, B minor, and that's essentially like, that's like a 2, 3, 4 in the key of A. So it doesn't really go to A or even F sharp very much. It's like it's on F sharp for like a little bit. But it's kind of suspending you a little bit outside of the key. So when this chord does show up, it's kind of like Okay, why the heck not? Because you kind of got your root there for a second, but you also, it's more like the root of this chord is actually the root of the key, and then it's sort of like a 1 over a flat 7 triad before it goes back to... Has the cadential drive, that kind of energy you want at the end of the phrase, but it's also kind of like, where are we a little bit? It's a little bit floaty, but I mean, the harmony definitely works. And I mean, I could sit here and try to explain it 6 gajillion different ways. I don't think it really matters. I think what you're going to see is this is the exact same voicing of a chord that we had in those other cases, but in this case, instead of being at like, instead of being the 4 triad and the 5 bass, this is the 1 bass and the flat 7 triad. So in the key of A, you just went going like this. You had A triad here, you can do open A, slide it down to G. But then you go back to this 4, 3, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 2. It goes to the 6 for a little bit, and then, So that's another example, is like you took the same voicing of the chord and you transposed it. So, I wonder where else we could transpose this sucker. Now, James Taylor is another popular abuser of these chords, and in Shower the People's a really good example. He's kind of zipping away. And I'm going to kind of do this in defingering here. A couple of times in this song, he gets to this chord, which is, again, same voicing we're talking about. We got an A chord with a B in the bass. So it's the same chord we're talking about, but in the key of D, he's doing the 6 bass with the 5 triad, and what gives. I don't really know. I mean, there's 2 instances in the song where it shows up, and they kind of come about different ways. So it kind of gives you some insight about how it can act differently in different voice leading situations. When he's doing the chorus, he's going like, shower the people you love with love. And there it is right there. He's essentially just doing E minor and A over the chorus, but the bass line goes essentially 3-6. He just gets a 3-6. It's almost like he's doing 3-6-2-5. 1. It's kind of imitating that a little bit, but he's holding the 5 chord and you just get a 3-6 bass out of nowhere. So again, it's like the bass player forgot what was going on and played the wrong bass notes, but it wasn't that bad, so you just kind of leave it. So it gives it a very interesting color. There's no question about that. The other place it occurs in the song is in the bridge, where you get the same figure, but as it's leading into the bridge, it kind of ends the chorus. Things are gonna be much better if you only will. You wind up on this B minor, which is the 6, and it goes. There's that little figure right there, and that is essentially you're on the 6 chord. You slide down, you go from the 6 to the 5 in the treble, but you just leave the bass the same. So this is essentially what we just saw back in September, where you have like the 6 is kind of a resting point too. It can kind of be like the minor 1 in a way, but you just kind of go down to the flat 7 right below that and back up, and you just leave the bass the same. And why not? Works. So that's another way that it gets used. It kind of ends up being like a pivot to 6 in a way, or just a color chord that shows in there. There's 2 other examples. Same voicing, 2 different contrapuntal realizations of the chord, and they work totally different ways. Now to take everything we just talked about and throw it totally out the window, because there's another voicing of this type of chord that shows up. The Tapestry album by Carole King just uses these altered bass triads like nobody's business. They're all over the album. And You Got a Friend has got a really interesting example in the chorus. It goes, you just call out my name, and you know wherever I am. So I'm playing this in the key of G right now. This is just a regular G chord. I got a G bass, G triad. Now what she does is she leaves the bass the same, but now the triad moves. So essentially, you've just got kind of this contrapuntal thing where you got this drone going on, but the triad is changing. Going 1 to 5 is no big deal, but the fact that you kind of leave the 1 the same, that kind of makes it, you got this D triad with a G bass. And if like a sus4, like the G is the sus4 of the G. So you essentially have a major triad with a 4th in the bass. Go figure. But I mean, in this kind of motion, it works really well. I've actually used this kind of motion in a couple of songs that I've written, and it works really well when you move it a couple different places. So just that basic idea of having like a G, and then it goes to a D, or like a 1 chord that goes to the 5 in the treble, but the bass stays the same. It's a really pretty chord. It's a little dissonant, so I wouldn't like just hang out on it forever, you know, unless you're trying to make a statement, but I mean, it works in its own way. So now that I've given you a bunch of examples, I got 2 missions for you. 1, go find more songs that we haven't found yet that use these chords in different ways, so we can just start to get an understanding of like what are the tricks that have already been invented. Then I highly recommend you go invent some of your own tricks. I mean, just try to get some stuff going on where you got triads and you got a bass, and then just go different directions and just see what you come up with. And realize that some of these chords really work stand alone, like you can just throw them in anywhere and they're like, woo, that's some nice stuff. And some of them really only work as part of certain voice leading actions, and that's okay. You can kind of discover what those are and innovate on them. But I mean, yeah, there's tons of territory on this, because I just feel like this is an area that people have toyed with a bit, but again, a lot of what I've seen are the same usages again and again and again. I think there's a lot of territory that is yet to be explored on these. And in fact, in the next video, I am going to show you a bunch of riffs that I wrote in songs I composed that use these in ways that I have never seen in other songs before. And I mean, they're just my innovations on stuff. So you might find those interesting. You might find those helpful. You might find them as a way to kind of inspire your own direction. It's kind of up to you. So yeah, check that video out if you dig it. And yeah, happy weekday.